Climb into the cab of a freight locomotive built this year and count the seats. There are 2. The engineer sits on the right, because that is where the throttle and the brake stand are. The other seat is on the left, facing forward, with its own window and its own view of the track. That seat was designed for a man whose position the federal government ruled unnecessary in November of 1963, and they are still building it into brand new machines more than 60 years later. It is not a leftover either. Federal regulation actively requires it. Title 49, Part 229, Section 47 says every road locomotive in the country, except one built for a single occupant, has to carry an emergency brake valve within reach of a crew member other than the engineer from that crew member's position in the cab. That rule was written in 1980. 16 years after the job, it quietly assumes had already been ruled surplus to requirements. And the strangest part is what the government wrote when it got rid of him. The board that eliminated the position said, in the same document, that the accusation against these men was unsupported, irresponsibly made, and that they were doing real and useful work. And then it removed them anyway. So who was sitting there, and why is his chair still bolted to the floor of a locomotive built in 2026? Before the real answer, let us clear out the 3 explanations most people reach for, because none of them survives 30 seconds with the federal record. The first guess is that the diesel simply killed the job. The man was a fireman, the diesel has no fire, so the job ended when the fire did. Neat, obvious, and wrong. The second is featherbedding. The union protected a man who did nothing, and somebody eventually called the bluff. That one was formally rejected in writing, which we will get to. The third is automation, the way it always seems to be. Except no machine appears anywhere in the ruling. Start with the fire, because the timing does not work at all. Diesels went into yard switching in 1925 and were hauling passenger trains by 1934. By the time this dispute reached its peak, 97% of American freight tonnage moved behind diesel power, and that figure comes from a message President Kennedy sent to Congress. The fireman outlived the fire by roughly 40 years. Whatever removed him, it was not the loss of the thing he was named after. Now, take the featherbedding charge, because this is the fact that should reframe the whole question in your head. In 1959, the railroads launched a national publicity campaign, putting the cost of railroad featherbedding at $500 million a year. 4 years of hearings followed. When the Federal Arbitration Board finally ruled, it opened by stating that the record contained no evidence to support the charge, frequently and irresponsibly made, that firemen in road freight and yard service were being paid to do nothing. Think about that. The body that abolished the job used the ruling itself to say the accusation was false. So this is not a job that quietly stopped existing. Everyone involved agreed the work was real, and it was deleted regardless. Which means we are looking for a reason powerful enough to pull a man off a locomotive immediately after a federal board certified that he was working. And the board gave one. It is a single sentence, and there is no machine anywhere in it. It says that the usual presence of the head brakeman in the cab obviates the need for a fireman. The reason the fireman was removed was another man. A second employee sitting a few feet away on the same footplate, doing part of the same watching. Hold on to that head brakeman. What happens to him at the end of this video is the part almost nobody sees coming. So how does a federal board get there? 3 things had to be in place, and the first explains the seat itself. On a steam locomotive, the boiler sits directly between the crew and the track ahead, and the engineer on the right cannot see past it to the left side of the right-of-way. So the second man watched the road and the signals from the left-hand window and called out what he saw. Feeding the fire was one duty. Watching the half of the world the engineer was blind to was the other. When the fire went away, that second duty did not go anywhere. That is why the seat outlived the fuel, and why shopmen still call that side of a diesel cab the fireman's side today. The second thing is a contract signed for a fleet that barely existed. In 1937, the carriers and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen signed the National Diesel Agreement. It required a fireman on every passenger train and on every freight and yard locomotive weighing more than 90,000 pounds. Here is the catch. At the moment of signing, the federal chronology notes, very few diesels were in service anywhere. The union had secured manning rights over a fleet nobody had built, and the carriers signed because in 1937, that sentence cost them nothing. 22 years later, on the 2nd of November 1959, they served the notice that opened the longest labor dispute in American history, trying to escape a clause they had agreed to when it was free. The third thing is the sheer size of the machinery built to settle it, which I think is genuinely underappreciated. President Eisenhower created the Presidential Railroad Commission by executive order in November of 1960, and Judge Simon Rifkind chaired it. 79 witnesses appeared in person, statements were filed for 155 more, and the hearings produced over 15,500 pages of testimony and 300 exhibits. Then the unions did something I love. They sent their members out with cameras. More than 30 railroad employees, most of them firemen and engineers, photographed yards, sidings, terminals, and locomotives across 48 different carriers, and submitted 1,656 photographs as evidence that the work was real. Those pictures are sitting at Cornell right now. It did not work. The Commission reported on the 28th of February, 1962, agreed that 40,000 firemen were not needed, and recommended the railroads be given an unlimited right to technological change. The carriers accepted, the unions refused, and the country ended up days away from a national rail strike. If you are enjoying this kind of thing, the paperwork and the machinery and the decisions buried underneath both, do me a favor and subscribe. This channel takes these things apart properly. What Congress did next had never been done in American peacetime. On the 28th of August 1963, Public Law 88-108 imposed compulsory arbitration on an American industry. 7 members, 3 of them from the public, 2 from the carriers, and 2 from the unions. Congress was uneasy enough about the precedent that it wrote an expiry date into the award itself. Nothing decided could bind anyone for more than 2 years. Arbitration Board. Number 2. 82 issued its award on the 26th of November 1963. Now read the 2 findings in the order they appear. There is no evidence to support the charge that these men are being paid to do nothing. The usual presence of the head brakeman in the cab obviates the need for a fireman. Cleared in the first sentence, eliminated in the second. Same board, same document, same afternoon. The union came away with exactly one thing. It could veto 10% of the crews the carriers listed for elimination on grounds of safety or undue work burden, and those vetoes were final and binding. Somebody had to sit down with that list and choose which one in 10 kept working. The scale of what followed is on the record. The award took effect on the 25th of January, 1964, and expired on the 31st of March, 1966. In those 26 months, roughly 18,000 fireman jobs disappeared, about 60% of everything the award covered. By 1970, the carriers were telling another presidential board that the industry had saved over $1 billion in 6 years. The same board recorded the rest. Remaining firemen cost $179 million a year, and putting the eliminated jobs back would have added $233 million more, for a total the carriers said came to 2/3 of the net operating income of every railroad in the country. 20,000 firemen were still on the payroll. That board was Emergency Board No. 177, created by Nixon on the 7th of July 1970, the same day the Union struck the Baltimore and Ohio, the Louisville and Nashville, and the Southern Pacific. It opens its report by calling this the nation's longest extant labor dispute, and it is refreshingly blunt about everything that came before. Award 282, it says, became a battleground for litigation and failed to do what Congress wanted. Then it made 2 recommendations, and the second one is the answer I promised you. The first was that every fireman shoved into a bad job by the award should get one agreed date to freely re-exercise his seniority across every position available. The board gave that date a name in a formal report to the President of the United States. It called it Sadie Hawkins Day. The second recommendation was a brand new dual-purpose classification combining the functions of the fireman and the brakeman into one job. Look at what that actually means. The fireman was eliminated in 1963 because the head brakeman was already sitting in the cab. 7 years later, the federal solution was to fuse the two of them into a single man. The head brakeman did not outlast the fireman. He absorbed him, and then in his turn, he was absorbed as well. The settlement arrived in July of 1972. The 18,000 remaining firemen could keep working until they retired, resigned, died, were discharged for cause, or were promoted to engineer. 5 exits written into a contract, and no new man would ever hold that seniority again. Now, in the interest of being fair, the railroads were not making all of this up. There genuinely was no fire, and the stoker was pointless. Coal handling had gone, and the whole economy of labor around it went with the coaling towers, which is a story this channel has been through before. Money really was draining out of the industry too. American railroads employed 2 million people in 1920 and 780,000 by 1960. Kennedy, arguing on the side of the men, used a phrase that concedes the point completely. He called what the diesel had done to the firemen human obsolescence. The problem was real. The record shows the carriers lost the argument they chose to make and won the one they never made. Let me deal with the objections that are already forming down there. They were not automated out. The ruling names no machine whatsoever, and the reason printed on the page is a second employee. The featherbedding charge was not upheld either. It was explicitly rejected by the very board that acted on the case. Nobody was sacked in 1963. The elimination ran through attrition over 9 years, and the last protected men worked well into a decade the award never contemplated. And the seat is not sentiment. Federal regulation still requires a brake valve within reach of that position on every road locomotive not built for one person today. Which brings us to a federal courtroom this month. On the 11th of August, 2026, the 11th Circuit upheld the rule requiring 2 people on most American freight trains, 2 votes to 1. The railroads had asked for the unrestricted right to decide when a second man is needed. That is the 1959 notice again, almost word for word. The cab has gone from 4 men down to 2 by the same argument applied over and over. Every single time, the man being removed is unnecessary because the man next to him is still there. There is 1 seat left to make that argument about. So why does every locomotive still have a seat for a man whose job ended in 1963? Nobody forgot to unbolt it, and the railroads were never sentimental about him. The work he did was never shown to be nothing either. It is still there because the reason he was taken out was never that the job vanished. It was that somebody else was already sitting close enough to cover it, and that piece of reasoning does not stop working when it runs out of firemen. It slides 1 seat over and waits. Every fixture on a working machine is an answer to a question, and on the railroad, those questions usually get asked by accidents and arbitrators. That left-hand seat is the answer to a boiler you could not see past. It outlived the boiler, it outlived the fire, it outlived the man it was built for, and there is still a brake handle beside it that federal law says has to be within reach. So here is my question for you. If they take the last man out of that seat, is what remains still a crew, or is it just an operator? Tell me down in the comments, because I do read them, and this argument is not over.